All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to today's explainer. We toss the words normal and abnormal around all the time in our daily lives, right? But clinically speaking, the dividing line between the two is incredibly specific. Today, we're going to unpack the exact criteria that psychologists use to distinguish a healthy, well-adjusted personality from one that is fundamentally disorganized. But before we even touch on what's considered abnormal, we've got to start with a pretty fundamental question about our own baseline. What exactly makes a personality normal? It's super tempting to think of normalcy as just being average or maybe just following the rules. But as we're going to see from the clinical literature today, true normalcy is way more active and dynamic than just blending into the background. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. Defining normal human behavior. 2. Key traits of normalcy. 3. The pivot to abnormality. 4. Signs of abnormal personality. And 5. The adjustment spectrum. Section 1. Defining normal human behavior. Psychologists Maslow and Middleman hit the nail on the head here, noting that a complete person is someone who overcomes dangerous and frustrating circumstances. What I absolutely love about this definition is that it tells us being normal isn't about having a perfect, totally problem-free life. It's really about resilience. It is about how we face down the frustrating hurdles that life inevitably throws at us. So, the crucial takeaway here, harmony. Normal behavior essentially means living a life where your internal world is completely in sync with the external physical and social world around you. When you've got that harmony, you've got a healthy baseline.
Section 2. Key traits of normalcy.
So what does this actually look like day to day? First up, setting realistic life goals. A normal person actually sizes up their own physical and mental fitness and maps out their ambitions accordingly. Whether they want to be an engineer, a doctor, or whatever else, they aren't setting totally impossible targets that ignore reality. They keep their ambitions grounded. Building on that, a normal personality leans on two massive pillars: security and reality. First, they have adequate feelings of security under normal circumstances. And notice that distinction, under normal circumstances. Because feeling insecure about, say, a genuine physical illness, that's totally normal. But generally speaking, they feel secure. Second, they maintain an efficient, grounded contact with reality. They understand the social and physical world around them, and their thinking is rooted entirely in facts, not fantasy. Then there's this concept called adequate emotionality. This is absolutely vital. Basically, it means expressing only as much emotion as a situation actually calls for. Think of it as the Goldilocks zone for feelings. Having zero emotion, that is considered abnormal. But flying off the handle and expressing way more emotion when needed, also abnormal. Normalcy lives right there in the balanced middle. To round out the normal side of the equation, we have to look at growth and stability. Healthy individuals actually learn from their past mistakes. They don't just blindly repeat them. Plus, their personality shows real integration, meaning their internal drives, their id, ego, and superego are stable and consistent. And finally, they're capable of adequate self-evaluation. They know how to accurately measure their own self-worth. Section 3, the pivot to abnormality. Now think about what happens when we pivot away from that baseline. There's a stark contrast here. On one side, we have that foundation of adequate security. But on the other, the abnormal departure. An intense, overriding feeling of insecurity and suspicion. The individual literally stops feeling like an accepted part of society. They start viewing everyone around them with suspicion and totally lose their social freedom. This right here is the absolute root of maladjustment. Section 4, signs of abnormal personality. So how does this actually manifest? Well, abnormal behavior often shows up outwardly as a complete social and behavioral breakdown. You start seeing antisocial behaviors that actively violate standard societal norms. There's also this profound poor adjustment, meaning the person just cannot adapt systematically to different situations anymore. This spirals into a total lack of social adaptability, which heavily strains relationships with their family and society at large.
If we look under the hood at the internal mechanism driving this, we find a severe mental imbalance. A person exhibiting abnormal behavior experiences wild instability in their thoughts. They might think one way and then abruptly flip to the exact opposite, which leads directly to erratic or wrong behavior. The internal consistency we saw in the normal baseline is just gone.
And this constant mental imbalance creates what clinicians call a disorganized personality. There is literally zero coherence in their cognitive, emotional, or affective states. Because their thoughts lack any sort of integration, their behavior becomes so wild and unbalanced that it's practically impossible for an outside observer to make any sense of it. Furthermore, this includes severe emotional dysregulation. Remember that adequate emotionality we talked about earlier? Yeah, that goes completely out the window. Instead, we see intense emotional immaturity, like crying or laughing for absolutely no reason. There is this constant tension and hypersensitivity. The person basically has no control over their impulses and gets easily, intensely overwhelmed by the simplest, most mundane events. And this emotional immaturity, it is deeply, deeply tied to that intense feeling of insecurity we touched on a minute ago. Because they can't regulate their own emotions, and because they view the world through a lens of fear and suspicion, they naturally feel totally unaccepted by society. It becomes this vicious, compounding psychological tension. Internally, this translates to some massive cognitive disconnects. Abnormal personalities often suffer from a complete lack of insight. They lose that standard grasp on what's true or false, moral or immoral, and because of that, they feel absolutely no remorse or regret for their wrongdoings. They will just commit one wrong act after another, totally unbothered, simply because they lack the self-knowledge to even evaluate why they're doing it.
Section 5, the adjustment spectrum.
Which brings us to the core takeaway of today's explainer. It all boils down to how we evaluate ourselves. Normal behavior completely relies on adequate self-evaluation, knowing your actual strengths and playing to them. Abnormal behavior, on the flip side, stems heavily from an improper evaluation of the self. When someone operates without understanding their own real limitations, they hit a wall of deep frustration and inferiority. Their potential is just wasted because they can't anchor their choices in reality. So, I'm going to leave you with this final thing to chew on. How do these clinical criteria of adjustment and self-evaluation shape your understanding of the people around you? The next time you witness a profound lack of harmony or some totally erratic outburst, you now have the actual clinical framework to understand the disorganized personality behind it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning that baseline.